It should be good evening. Hopefully, people can see me fairly well on here. We're trying a different streaming option, so we're going to see how well that works. Streaming to live here to Facebook and also to YouTube. So, anyhow, it's gradually getting towards Thanksgiving, so I'm assuming there may be a few people who are not working or are home from work and can maybe tune in. Anyhow, the topic that I want to talk about here is the Masters runner. So you might ask, what is a Masters runner? Now, most races tend to define a Masters runner as someone that is 35 or older. I think typically a lot of people in the running world tend to think of it as 40 and over. And the reason we want to think about the Masters runner is that there are unique characteristics of what happens to us as we age, and then unique things that happen in terms of injuries and biomechanics and whatnot that we want to consider. And now, if you're listening to this or looking at the thing and say, okay, I'm not a Masters runner, I'm 20, I'm 25, I'm 30, this doesn't really apply to me. Well, actually, it is worth thinking about because what happens to you in your 20s and 30s does have an effect on how you're going to do in your 40s, 50s, and so on. So, anyhow, without further ado, we'll talk a little bit about what happens as we age. So, basically, as we age, basically our VO2 max pretty much drops linearly per decade. So, basically, we're going to slow down. That's something we can't really fight so much, but training can't stop it. But we can actually, slow that process down a bit. And so we find our running speeds decline, our step rate increases, our stride length shortens. In general, we see a reduction in muscle mass. We call this age-related sarcopenia. But we see a particular focus of this in the calf. So, we see this general loss of muscle, but we also see it particularly in the calf. And we're not 100% sure why there's this particular focus. If it's the reduction in the bulk, if it's the reduction in what we call neural drive, what sort of input is to the muscle. But we know that it's a negative thing for the aging runner. And it's one of those chicken egg scenarios, really. We don't know so much. Does the gait change as a result of the strength and power reducing? Or is it vice versa? So we don't really know that. But we do know that Masters runners have less stiffness. Basically, this result, the lack of strength, the lack of power results in less stiffness in the Masters runners' tendons. And you might think, wow, cool. I don't want to be stiff. That doesn't sound very good. Surely runners and athletes shouldn't be stiff. Well, actually, we're talking about tendon stiffness here. And we want the tendon to be like a spring. We want it to have that great ability to absorb and release load every stride. So in our younger runners, we tend to see more stiffness in the tendons. In our older runners, unfortunately, we see less stiffness in the tendons, and that means the tendons tend to be less resilient to load and less able to deal with load. So we want to do things that will help us to generate load capacity and improve that. So basically, in our 20s and 30s, we tend to see different injury mixes. We tend to see stress fractures, we tend to see IT band problems, we tend to see some pain in the front of the knee, shin splints. They're typically a lot of the type of problems we see in 20s and 30-year-old runners. But along with these changes we see in how our bodies age, we then start to see different issues. So our Masters runners tend to have more tendon problems. Particularly, we tend to see more muscle problems and calf problems, and of the tendon problems, we tend to see more Achilles problems. That's really one of the big things. And this shouldn't necessarily be a surprise to us because, like I said a minute ago, we get this age-related sarcopenia, this loss of muscle size as we age, particularly focused on the calf. And the what we also know is that the calf is hugely important. The calf is responsible for up to 50% of your vertical force when you run. Now, if you've followed any of the stuff that I've talked about before, you'll be familiar with some of these graphics that I'll pop up, but I'll pop this one up here and we can see that the calf in walking, 3.5 times body weight force goes through it. In a single leg heel raise, 3.5 times body weight force goes through it. But then when we're running, anything from 4.5 times to 8 times body weight force goes through it. It's incredibly important. As I say, it produces 50% of the vertical force with running. I'll put one other little slide up on here that I can find it. Where did you go? This should be it. What you can see here, and it's kind of a little bit small, but this is at different paces. Okay, I'll make it a little bigger for you so you can see it actually. Here we go. So at different paces. So at 12.6 kilometers an hour, we can see that the soleus up here is king. It's producing nearly 7 times body weight force. Down here, glute max, 0.3 times body weight force. As we go faster, basically up to nearly 30 kilometers an hour, really the calf muscle still produces a lot of force, but at some point between those last two speeds, the hip flexor, iliopsoas, oops, didn't mean to get that small. The hip flexor, iliopsoas, the blue line, and the hamstrings, that yellow line, kind of start to overtake. So basically a sprinter or a really sort of top-notch 800-meter runner is going to get a lot more hip flexor and hamstrings driving their speeds. But for our distance runners, we're talking about the calf muscle really being the king or the queen. So again, going back to our masters runner, we've lost muscle strength overall, and it's particularly focused on the calf muscles. And unfortunately, we lose that drive, and all of a sudden we start to have more of a risk of getting injured. Now, obviously, there are other things that go on when we age, and these kind of things confound. They actually play a part in as well. So as we age, our tendons get more fat kind of infiltrating them, a bit like, if you get a cut of meat and you can see how fatty it is, how marbled it is. Our tendons get more fat infiltrating them as we age. So, that tends to affect how well they recover from injury and how well they perform. So, for example, like in someone's rotator cuff, if they've got a very degenerated tendon, a lot more fat infiltration because they're 70 or 80, doing a repair in there carries a bit more risk because it's not actually going to hold. Now, we have other factors like other medical issues like diabetes. So, diabetics tend to have more issues in their tendons. And then we have medication type problems. So we know that as a group of antibiotics, fluoroquinolones, they have an effect on tendons. So we know that there are other factors that affect tendons, that affect muscles, and some of these unfortunately just do come about as we get older. So we get the loss of muscle mass, and then we have all these other factors. So what can we do to try to minimize or slow these effects? And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how younger people potentially could get something out of this talk. And I sound like an old fart saying that, unfortunately. But basically, what we can do is we can try to maintain volume and intensity as best we can. So, unfortunately, as we age, we typically volume drops. The amount of intensity drops down as well. But actually, the better we can maintain that, probably the better our odds of actually not losing as much muscle mass and not struggling as we age with our running. And I think this is important because, one thing we see with our runners, something we kind of term the Goldilocks principle in rehab, is that we've got runners who do too much and we've got runners who don't do enough. And it's kind of finding that balance in how we approach things. So if I get hurt, what do I do? Well, one of the worst things we can do is just continue to train exactly the same as we are and make that hurt worse. But equally as bad is stopping altogether because we lose a lot of capacity. So typically, I don't ask my runners to stop running unless they've got something like a stress fracture. My goal is to try and keep you running in a way that's modified so you don't lose capacity. So it's really trying to find that balance, that, like I say, that Goldilocks principle of just the right amount. Um, a lot of runners, if they take that 4 weeks off, what's the instinct? Been there and done it. We do too much. Maybe I'll just do an easy couple of miles. Well, if you haven't, you may have done some cross training during that 4 weeks off, maybe some bike, maybe some swimming. So you've kept your aerobic ability. And so when you get back to that first run, oh, it doesn't feel too bad. You've got the aerobic ability, but have you got the ability to take those impacts? No, you've lost some capacity over the 4 weeks. So it makes sense to actually build things up slowly. You go back too fast, too soon, or too far and too soon, and you re-injure yourself. So, like I say, the Goldilocks principle, kind of finding that right balance, that makes a big difference in how we go about trying to maintain as much volume and intensity through each decade of life, and hopefully not lose as much ability and capacity over those decades. So one of the other things, like we talked about a minute ago, is the loss of muscle mass. So we want to try and fight that loss of muscle mass. And again, this is where we could start earlier on in life. So a lot of runners historically have just run, and unfortunately, that is not a great way in maintaining strength. It's not a great way of building up in getting good stiffness in the tendons. So this is why I really enjoy working with my young runners, my 14, 15-year-old high school runners, some of them just recreational, but a lot of them who want to run cross country. Historically, when I was in high school, there was no real emphasis on lifting. If there was any exercise, it was body weight and it was lots of reps because you were doing exercise for endurance. But if you're running 30, 40, 50 odd miles a week, you're getting your endurance there. So instead, we need to actually start to lift heavy things. We know how helpful that is. So when we start to lift heavy weights a couple of times a week, we start to increase stiffness in our tendons. We are going to get some increase in muscle mass, but you know what? If you're running all these miles a week, you're not going to all of a sudden turn into Schwarzenegger and bulk up. We also get increase in bone formation and remodeling. So there's lots and lots of positives of strength training to go along with the positives that we know, like the cardiovascular positives of running. So basically, and this is kind of my little disclaimer here. You obviously, if you've got an injury, you've got to make sure you get that checked out first. So you're not going to go straight from injury into lifting heavy if you don't know what it is. But typically, a lot of the injuries that we deal with, tendon problems, muscle problems, even bone problems, we want to lift heavy to encourage that change in physiology and to build that capacity up. So we've got different types of exercises. We can do compound exercises like squats. We can also do more specific exercises like leg extensions, like in a machine, for example. And they both have their purpose. But the key is that you've got to lift heavy. Going back to that chart I had up on screen, I'll put it back up here. I mean, the lowest speed in this graph, that calf muscle there, soleus, is producing nearly 6 or 7 times body weight force. That's incredibly high. I'll go back to this other graph, this other chart here, this one here, that when we run, we're taking 4.5 to 8 times body weight force through the calf. So the loading experience with running is actually incredibly high. So we need to lift heavy as runners. Doesn't have to be tons. Like I say, a couple of times a week is good. You put those out the way. So probably we're talking about somewhere about 8 reps eventually, get building up to 8 reps where you've got maybe a couple of reps left in reserve. That's probably going to be your end goal. It might be that you start off with a little bit easier, maybe 15 reps where it feels comfortable, and then build sort of to 10 reps where you've got 2 in reserve. But eventually getting towards 8 reps with 2 in reserve is incredibly positive. And like I say, it has effects on various different tissues in building their capacity to kind of give you a bigger envelope of capacity. And like I say, that fights that loss in muscle mass, and it fights that tendon stiffness loss that we get in each decade of life. So I think, getting lifting at an early age and kind of keeping that through is great. If you haven't done that, if you've just taken up running as a in your 40s or 50s, running alone is not enough. And we're starting to see that in the research. You've got to do some heavy lifting. I say body weight exercise doesn't cut it. So I think if you can start to integrate that in, it's going to help you to reduce injury risk. It's going to help you to enjoy your running performance, and hopefully then run several decades more. And I've worked with runners who are running in their 70s and 80s, and it's pretty inspirational when you see what they've been able to do. I think other considerations in the lifting is that, especially if you've had some pain problems, is to actually give yourself a day off. But you can combine lifting and running actually on the same day. The research tends to suggest that that's a positive. In an ideal world, you have 2 or 3 hours between those sessions, but obviously we're not professional athletes, so I tend to find that doing the lifting first and then running is positive because it kind of sets a warm up versus lifting and then running and then lifting, because if you run, you're worn out, you're probably not going to want to go and lift. If running is your prime sport and you lift first, you're still going to get that run done. And that's one of the challenges, honestly. A lot of my runners don't want, a lot of runners I meet don't want to lift. It's not their joy, but actually once they start to see the positive effects of lifting on their running, they tend to be very interested in doing it. So we've talked about a few things there that can help to reduce this sort of age-related decline in our running, and just the fact that we get more injuries, unfortunately, when we're more years of injury when we're older, and unfortunately we get more multiple injuries when we're older. Other things that can help us as we, again, any decade's life, but I think particularly when we've got more injuries happening to us, is making sure we get enough sleep, making sure that we are well recovered. I think trying to understand the different stresses in life and how to deal with them better, maybe even considering professional help with that if we need to, because we know that stress has an effect on our likelihood of getting hurt and our likelihood of experiencing pain. So, figuring out better ways to deal with that other than just exercise is important, because if our exercise is giving us a problem, we can't deal with our stress. It's this vicious cycle of things. So I think thinking about that a little bit more deeply and being willing to maybe try different things is quite important. Other warming up, I think is quite helpful, because we know that the tendons are less stiff, which is a negative. We know that there's more fat infiltration into the tendons, which is negative. So these tendons, unfortunately, as we age, they just aren't as good as they were when we were 20. So I think making sure we do a good warm up is actually very, very important. Now, what does that look like? It can look like different things. I don't think it should involve stretching, like static stretching. We've got no evidence to say that that's beneficial for runners. I see runners who are getting themselves into all sorts of crazy positions doing stretches, and I think again, actually, when you're older, if your tendons aren't as healthy, you're probably more likely to hurt a tendon stretching than actually do anything beneficial for it. So I think really what it involves, warm up should be walking for a while just to get the heart rate up and to warm things up. Maybe some more dynamic stretches, just some gentle butt kicks and gentle leg swings. And then not just immediately going into your planned pace, but just building the pace up of the run as you go through the first quarter to half a mile, and then going at the pace you want to go for the rest of that run. Other things that runners tend to I think clutch onto are things that feel good. That's completely understandable. We all want to do things that feel good. So massage guns, foam rollers, um, maybe massages themselves, they're fine. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do them, but I think it's a matter of we need to make sure that we aren't misunderstanding what to do. Like people want to think that the massage gun or the roller breaks tissue down or puts things in place or whatever. They don't do that. They've not got the strength like to do that. Um, we can't, like an IT band, for example, you need like 1,000 newtons to deform that IT band by 1%. So that's like the equivalent of getting in a car wreck. You can't do anything with a foam roller to that. So that goes back though to the stuff we've talked about already, like the importance of the masters athlete of actually lifting weights. We've got evidence to show the benefit of that. We've got evidence to really refute the benefits of these other things. I say it's not to say they don't feel good, and maybe they help you to feel a little bit better for the run the next day. But foam rolling, massage guns, they're not going to stop you from getting hurt. They're not going to fix the problem of pain if you've got, let's say, tendon pain. So I think it's okay to do it, but just don't clutch on. Don't expect it to do something where it's not gonna be possible to do. Um, so yeah, so I think the big takeaways are as you get older, unfortunately, you get slower. Unfortunately, your muscle bulk goes down, the resultant tendon stiffness goes down, so it's less of a spring-like action in your legs. And the big sort of focal area for this is your calf muscles. So I've always tell my patients, calf is king, calf is queen. That is the case for running from just a biomechanical standpoint in general, but it's particularly, I think, the important point as we get older. So we really should make sure that we do strength training a couple of times a week. I think it should hit the legs as a whole. It should be heavy, but I really do think we should pay particular attention to making sure we get the calves, which a lot of people I've met have never done any real strength training for their calves other than just a few calf raises, which they're just not heavy enough load anyway. So get a couple of times a week heavy loading into your routine as a runner, and it can, I think, help to slow the aging process down a bit. Can it reverse the years? I'm not sure we're into miracles like that, but I think at the very least it can slow the process down. It might make your runs feel a bit better as well. I know with injured runners that I see at different decades in life, you add that strength training component in, and they can see some pretty big changes. So anyhow, I hope that you found that useful as a masters runner. And unfortunately, I find myself as a masters runner now. If you're a younger runner, I think hopefully there are some little bits of that are useful to you as well. And we'll have to see. If you've got any questions, do please message me. You can put messages in the comments, or you can shoot me a message by email, or you can call the PhysioWorks number. If you're local, I'd be happy to help to chat to you about running injuries and what we might be able to do to help. So anyway, I hope you have a good evening, and I'll look forward to being online with you all another time. You take care.